Eleftherios Eleftherakis was my orchestra teacher and director for 6 years, from 7th grade through the end of high school. Eleftherios Eleftherakis, Eleftherios meaning free, freedom. And akis is a Crete ending indicating patriarchy. So Eleftherios Eleftherakis is basically free man, son of free man. He was a dignified man, if we can use that term. It's not often used these days. Quiet, and a wonderfully dedicated musician who played violin for the Boston Pops Orchestra and taught at one of the music schools in Boston. And so looking back now, I can't quite imagine the patience, musically or otherwise, that he must have had to start in September of every year and incorporate all the new 12 and 13-year-old beginners with their various instruments into an entity that together could produce at least a reasonably pleasing sound by the time the holiday season rolled around in December. From chaos somehow emerged order. I don't remember him ever getting angry or yelling, and yet early on he somehow managed to create an atmosphere of calm and cooperation. Without asking, he engendered trust and respect. No one ever called him Mr. E. That wouldn't have fit. He was always Mr. Eleftherakis. I have 3 memories of my first year in the junior high orchestra. I played trumpet, by the way. Many people asked me after the last service because I didn't say. The first, and I'm not totally sure that it's a direct memory, but it's certainly what I think of as a memory from that time, or maybe it's something that I experienced later on. But it's an experience of listening to a youth orchestra, and I can clearly hear it now, even now, a slightly uncoordinated and more than occasionally off-pitch sound of a group plowing their way through Finlandia by Sibelius. The second memory was a time when we played together with the high school orchestra in a combined concert for a school assembly, and we got the sense in that combined concert of what we were working towards. We were, of course, watching and noticing how the high school group played, how they carried themselves, how they responded to Mr. Eleftherakis, and we learned something more valuable than the notes on the score. The third and very distinct memory I have of junior high orchestra was on the day of President Kennedy's assassination. We were on the stage practicing in the junior high auditorium when somebody leaned in through one of the doors in the back of the hall and called out that the president had been shot. We didn't know whether he was going to live or not. Mr. Eleftherakis turned slowly back to us calmly and said, "If that's true, it's a terrible thing." He asked for silence and then asked us to go back to the beginning of the piece we were working on and play it all the way through with emotion. I have no idea how it sounded. But when we were done, Mr. Eleftherakis put his hands together and bowed to us. And that's the end of the memory. But it was a moment that I won't forget. A coming together, a bonding in that group. Later on in high school, we somehow learned that Mr. Eleftherakis had been a prisoner of war in Germany during World War II. And then I think we figured that any stress that we students or the current world might have thrown at him was nothing compared to what he had experienced back then. And maybe it explained why he could be so calm and cool. An orchestra is one of those systems where the whole can turn out much greater than the sum of its parts. Surely there's a beauty in the sound of each instrument, and certainly individual talents and skills of director and musicians are brought to bear, but there's more to it than that. There are norms and expectations. There's an understanding of what the group is trying to accomplish, hopefully a trust between everyone involved, a level of communication so that everyone understands their part, and a dedication on the participants' part, not just for honing their own craft and studying their part, but to the collective, to something more. When an orchestra works and plays together as one, the results can be breathtaking, not just for those sitting in the audience listening, but for those creating the music as well. Orchestras, however, are designed to accomplish the goal of being greater than the sum of its parts, and any ensemble that can't make it happen will find themselves playing to empty auditoriums more often than not. But what about other kinds of systems and organizations where there's no such obvious result? In a community like this one, for example, can we have the sense that we're creating something meaningful together that lifts us all up beyond the work of individual volunteer or committee or staff? I believe we can. In fact, I believe there's something akin to that happening here every day. I feel it. And I felt it even before I came almost 5 years ago, as I talked about earlier. There was something happening here that was good. I spoke to it last week when we spent some time looking back into our history and seeing patterns emerging early on in the life of this congregation. People with a positive spirit building both literally and figuratively on what had come before. But this kind of thing doesn't just happen. And I think there are 5 elements that are necessary to build from the ordinary to something extraordinary. First, there needs to be an organizing principle with something universal built in. Second, there has to be something akin to a leap of faith. And no, I don't mean a religious leap of faith, so don't worry, those of you who might struggle with that. I mean a willingness for individuals to take something of a risk, to give up a little of themselves in order to make something good happen in the whole. Third, there needs to be the realization that things will change, that nothing remains the same, nothing is static, and if it does, then the energy will slowly ebb and things will fall apart. Fourth, success does not come easy. The process can be good or painful or both, but commitment and effort is required. And fifth, an ability to be resilient is important because even with the best planning, stuff happens. And the health and the flexibility to respond has to be there in the system. So an organizing idea. To create something out of nothing, order from chaos, requires an idea that acts as a bonding agent. There needs to be a cohesiveness that keeps all the parts working together even as the parts get larger and more complex. An idea gets thrown out there and 2 things can happen. It can go unnoticed or it can attract some interest. And of course, once the idea is out there, it will likely take on a life of its own. In 1975, when Bernie and Rita Turner threw out the idea of starting an ethical culture society here in Naples, it attracted some interest, but things didn't develop the way the Turners were expecting. Someone else said, well, sure, but what about a Unitarian Universalist fellowship? And so that's how things got started. Whether it was one kind of group or something a little different, the seed that germinated was probably more general than either. It was the idea of community, of coming together. A leap of faith. For that seed to even sprout, that first group of people, something akin to a leap of faith, and jumped in not knowing exactly where they might be headed. Just like every time someone new walks in the door today and stays and risks jumping in a little deeper to see if this place fits, the need to be in community is strong in us, whether we are introverted or extroverted. Either way, it still requires us to take a deep breath and a risk to step into the unknown for the first time. Of course, what those founding members or anyone that comes through the doors today may not have realized right away is that in taking that little leap of faith, in the hope that this place will recognize and accept them, they immediately become a part of the whole, and the dynamic of the whole changes immediately in ways that are unpredictable. And that's another thing about organizations. Things will change. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it isn't. What speaks to the health of a system is how well it responds to change and how resilient it is when stuff happens, like a hurricane, for example, or when things don't go according to everyone's expectations or when people disappoint us. 40-odd years ago, Bernie and Rita Turner realized their initial idea didn't have legs, but they were flexible enough to go with the flow, perhaps realizing that within their own idea of an ethical cultural society was the seed of something more important, community. And so they went with the flow and they helped make this place happen. Later on, when things got a little more organized and began looking a little bit more like a congregation and less like a discussion group, Bertie and Rita backed away a little, but continued to stay in touch, and while they rarely around these days, 43 years later, they still support this community financially. Success doesn't come easy. While there has been a lot of fun along the way, and last week we talked about the wonderful Valentine's celebrations that used to happen here and the one that's coming up, what we have today is the result of a lot of hard work, of planning and planting, of organizing and recruiting, of counting and recounting and asking for more and getting it, or sometimes making do, of thinking big and thinking small, of moving chairs and tables and constructing buildings. There have been stable times, and there have been times that weren't exactly comfortable, and there were people willing to stick with it and keep the beat going because they felt it was worth the sweat and the tears. And resilience is the key. It's worth the sweat and tears and the occasional heart palpitations, but bending, not breaking, and being flexible to respond to adversity is important because we sense that thing, that something that's not quite definable, something more to which we can become attached and in which we find hope. As with an orchestra, it requires that we all do our part to the best of our ability with an eye towards the greater good, helping each other to help the whole, feeling, if not knowing consciously, that we are slowly working to create that even higher order of beloved community where we will meet our expectations, our highest expectations, and our highest expectations of community. And even then, thankfully, the work will continue. There is one aspect of faith community where the sum will never be greater than its parts, and that is in raising funds to support the mission and vision. My contribution plus yours and yours will never mysteriously add up to something more on the balance sheet. So if we want to build community where the sum of who we are and what we do feels much greater than our individual and organized parts, and if we want to create a place for those who are here today and for those who will walk through the doors tomorrow, we will need to support that sense of possibility and hope with our time and our talents and our treasure, and not take for granted what we have nor diminish the possibilities of what we might become. I think I know now how Mr. Eleftherakis was able to do what he did for so long. He saw the possibilities inside every student and within the whole of each orchestra he led. He understood the power of working together, of honoring each contributor and holding the collective up as the ideal. He knew that those first weeks with the junior high orchestra would eventually turn into the final performance in high school, and it was more than enough to keep him going. He had the vision. May we so honor each other and the ideal of community and put ourselves to the task of building that something greater. So may it be.